The movie begins with a montage of many controversial court cases with the background music singing, "Let's go to prison." After the montage, the audience is introduced to the main character, John. He begins with a voiceover explaining that there are over 2 million Americans behind bars, which was a little larger than the population of Hudson. In addition, he shares that kids born in prison would fill 150 Little League teams, and the number of people who are raped each year in the American prisons could fill 3 stadiums. The scene then cuts to John, who had been released from prison but is seen buying a gun at a store. John's voiceover then continues, explaining that he had been incarcerated 3 times, and we see a montage of the 3 times that he was sent to prison. The first time, John was sent to prison when he was 8 years old. He tried to steal a news reporter's car that had a $1 million check intended to be given as a present for an interviewee, and he was caught trying to cash that check. At the courthouse, we see Judge Nelson, who sentences John to 7 years in juvie. The judge's words seem to ignite John's eagerness to commit crime, as the judge said something harsh before he sentenced him to the 7 years in juvie. And we see John attempting his second robbery, where he tries to steal money from 2 armed officers and is caught. And the same judge sentences him to 4 more years in prison. In John's third and final incarceration, we don't get to see John committing the crime. Instead, we hear the judge sentencing John to 4 to 7 years because he tried to steal a car that belonged to an officer. After his release from prison, John becomes fixated on getting revenge on Judge Nelson. And John's first attempt to ruin the life of Judge Nelson was to call the municipal courthouse posing as a reporter named Kennedy. And he tells them that he's from the Chicago Tribune who wanted to interview the judge. Despite the phone call, John is informed that Judge Nelson had died 3 years prior, which really pisses him off because this puts a dent in his plan of revenge. And the scene cuts to a strip club where John is sulking at the bar, and some stripper comes and offers him a lap dance, and he even refuses that. And shortly after, John reads in the newspaper that the judge's son Nelson is actually planning a memorial for his father, and John sees this as an opportunity to get his revenge. John attends the memorial and sees Nelson Jr. giving a speech representing a foundation for his father. John sneaks into Nelson's car, empties his asthma medication, steals his money, and spits in his coffee. Nelson then gets in his car and drives back to the office, and on his way he angrily calls Dwayne, who was in a meeting with his father's foundation board, and tells him that he no longer wants to do press conferences and interviews. He also tells Dwayne that he wants a fresca at his desk when he gets back. And once off the phone, Nelson puts on some music and tries to sing along, but being out of breath, he attempts to use his asthma medication, but realizes that there is none left. Nelson immediately starts hyperventilating and stops his car at a pharmacy. He runs into the pharmacy and ransacks the place in search of asthma medication, and meanwhile, John has been following Nelson and observes everything that's been happening. After the owners of the pharmacy assumed that Nelson was a crazy drug addict, one of them brought a gun and pointed it at Nelson. John then shoots his gun from outside, causing the owner to fire her gun in the roof, assuming that it was Nelson who fired. Nelson immediately runs out but is caught on the security camera. The scene then cuts to a jail where Nelson is on a phone call with his board, and they tell him to plead guilty in court and to step down as chairman of the foundation. But Nelson is not going to do that, and he refuses to do so, and he proceeds to threaten to fire all of them. Dwayne and the board then decide that they don't want Nelson to go out of prison, so they provide him with a very incompetent legal team, who allowed him to approach the judge and make a fool of himself. And inside the court, we're introduced to Judge Eva, who is presiding over Nelson's case. The case then proceeds to trial by jury, where we hear from a small number of jury members and see that they are unlikely to give Nelson the best chances of winning. And eventually, as expected, the jury finds Nelson guilty. And after the jury's verdict, Judge Eva sentences him to 3 to 5 years in Rosemore State Correctional Facility. And John has been observing all of this from the back of the room and is very happy with the verdict. At his house, John and his friends were smoking weed when one of his friends notices that John wasn't really feeling okay. And John wasn't feeling okay because he was contemplating the idea that he wasn't really satisfied with what happened to Nelson. And soon after, the doorbell rings and 2 men ask John to sell them some weed. And despite immediately realizing that they were undercover cops, John decides to proceed with the transaction because he wanted to get caught and get sent to prison. And back at the court, John immediately pleads guilty, and Judge Eva gives him a sentence of 3 to 5 years in Rosemore State Correctional Facility. On the prison bus heading to the prison, John introduces himself to Nelson, and during their conversation, he tells Nelson that they should be cellmates. When they arrive at the prison, they are told to line up and meet the warden, who starts his speech with a very dry joke. He tells the prisoners to raise their hands if they were innocent, and that he will let them go. And one of the prisoners falls for this trick, and as he raises his hand, the warden sends one of his guards to go hit him. The warden then proceeds to threaten the prisoners and introduce them to the head guard, Mr. Shanahan. The prisoners are now lined up and being allocated cell numbers, and John bribes one of the officers and is put in the same cell as Nelson. And inside, Nelson is very upset and he starts crying. John tries to console him by telling him that in prison, he needs to be very strong in order to survive. Another prisoner approaches John and gives him his mail. And John's voiceover continues, and he tells the audience that it takes about $54 to keep one person in prison, which is around $75 million a day and $28 billion a year. And during lunch, John starts informing Nelson on the informal prison structure and tells him about Leonard, who was the leader of the most powerful and feared group in prison. And at exactly 12:15, Leonard stabs a man on the lunch table where Nelson and John were eating. And when Mr. Shanahan asks who did it, Nelson narks on Leonard, causing a rift between the two friends. And after they had returned to their cell, John, who'd actually encouraged Nelson to snitch, pretends to be angry at him. The movie then takes us to the showers, where a scared Nelson is worried about dropping the soap. And a naked man named Barry approaches Nelson, and he starts talking to him in a very creepy, sensual way. And then John comes to Nelson's rescue and claims that Nelson belongs to him, making it clear that nobody was allowed to touch him. In the next scene, we see Nelson speaking to his attorney Dwayne through the wall. Nelson expresses his desperation to get out of prison, but Dwayne sarcastically offers him a fresh cut, knowing that Nelson is not allowed to have them in prison. And back in prison, John is making sure that Nelson has the worst possible experience by paying other prisoners to hit him and the cooks to put foul substances in Nelson's food. And meanwhile, Barry, eager to have Nelson for himself, offers John a deal: a half an ounce of weed and 4 packs of cigarettes. And that day, John arranges to be taken out of his cell by Mr. Shanahan and leaves Nelson all alone. And Barry's prison buddies then kidnap Nelson and take him to Barry's cell. And his cell was filled with a lot of romantic objects because Barry thought that something was gonna happen today. Barry then enters the cell and offers Nelson a drink, and after a very awkward conversation, Barry asks Nelson to give him an Eskimo kiss, and he just sends him back to his cell. In the morning, as Nelson writes to his pen pal about his experience, a man approaches him and warns him that Leonard is out of solitary and he's planning to kill him that day. And during lunch, Nelson panics and asks John if he should talk to Leonard and if it's a good idea that maybe then he won't kill him. And John, knowing that talking to Leonard is probably the worst idea, tells Nelson to do it anyways. And as Nelson talks to Leonard, he listens for a bit before stabbing him with forks and telling him to sit down. And despite the pain, Nelson listens to what Leonard had to say, and he reveals that he plans to kill him the same way he killed his father, with a hammer. And John offers Nelson 3 options. Either he kills himself, or waits for Leonard to do it, or to be put into solitary. And when Nelson chooses the third option, John punches a guard and frames Nelson for it, causing him to be thrown into solitary. And after only 2 days in solitary, Nelson is released and continues to worry about Leonard. And after much contemplation, Nelson decides to end his own life and obtains a bottle of boat cleaner from a fellow inmate. He writes a very PG-18 letter to his pen pal, who is revealed to be a 2nd grade boy. The scene then cuts to the boy reading Nelson's filthy letter to his class. And meanwhile, back at the prison, Nelson is preparing to end himself when Leonard enters his cell and starts beating him up. And during their struggle, a needle containing a boat cleaner falls out of Nelson's pocket, and he then tells Leonard that he tricked him into injecting himself with drugs. Leonard dies, and Nelson pulls off a power move by making it look like he killed him himself. The other prisoners are now scared of him, and they leave him alone. But John is furious about how things turned out. And back in the dining area, Nelson is approached by one of the members of the White Kingdom, a group of Nazi prisoners led by Leonard. And they express their happiness for Nelson killing their former leader and invite him to join their group, making him the new top dog in prison. And one day, Barry tries to deface Nelson in the bathroom, but he manages to convince him otherwise. However, members of the White Kingdom catch Barry backing off, and they start beating him up. And Nelson intervenes and makes peace with Barry, stopping the fight. Meanwhile, John is thrown into solitary confinement by Mr. Shanahan, even though he didn't really do anything wrong. And 3 weeks later, John is released from solitary and sees that Nelson has taken over the prison, changing the way that the prisoners live their everyday lives. And now that Nelson's parole hearing was coming up, John plans to sabotage it. He offers Nelson a soda, claiming that it's a farewell present, and soon after he ends up fainting. Apparently, John had put roofies in the drink and wrote white power and a Nazi symbol on Nelson's face, hoping to sabotage his parole hearing as he was unconscious. As the morning arrives, Nelson appears in front of the parole board. However, he is denied early release because of the writings on his face. And devastated, Nelson heads back to his cell where he's confronted by John. And in the ensuing altercation, John confesses that he was making Nelson's life miserable because of Nelson Sr., his father, who made John's life miserable. Just as the fight starts getting out of hand, Mr. Shanahan intervenes and proposes a very lose-lose situation, where if they wanted to fight, they had to fight until the death, but the winner would also have to be killed by him. And the fight is then called off, and Mr. Shanahan proceeds to arrange a betting opportunity for the prisoners and the prison guard, in which the warden himself is also involved. Meanwhile, Barry is released after a parole board hearing and visits Nelson at the prison, and together they hatch up a plan to take back the Foundation from Dwayne and the others. And after being adopted by Nelson, Barry becomes eligible to become the chairman of the board. As bets are made and the scene is set, the two prisoners are taken outside to fight to the death. However, after a brutal fight scene, both prisoners take out needles that are meant to contain a kill dose, and they inject each other with their respective needles, and they both collapse on the floor. And the doctor pronounces both of them to be dead. And at the funeral, Barry waits for everyone to leave and he starts digging up Nelson's grave. And to everyone's surprise, Nelson emerges from the casket alive. And then we learn that John, Nelson, and Barry were actually working together to escape the prison that they would have surely died in. And after digging up John's casket, he too emerges from the grave. The movie ends by showing us the scene 1 year later, where all three men have opened a wine selling business and are doing very well for themselves. And that, boys and girls, is how our movie ends. I hope you guys liked our recap. Remember to leave a like, subscribe to our channel. I will see you guys on the next recap. Bye!